Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair 3500X. I've now built in this case twice in two different ways, and this is a behind the scenes look at that where I'm going to talk to you about all the different things that I discovered along the way. I'm going to talk to you about the interesting highlights of the case, but also the wiring logic and things for the RS fans, and for Corsair's iCue Link Titan RGB cooler, as well as the interesting problems that I found along the way with 3500X, and how it compares to the 6500X, which I did a video on previously, and you can see that case here, so stick with me now and find out more. It's fairly obvious from the front of the case that this is designed for a BTF motherboard, rear connect motherboard. You can see there's loads of cutouts out here, and from the initial appearance it actually looks really good for that. You can see there's loads of potential holes for putting the cables through and wiring everything up at the rear. And from what I understand, this case is designed more with a rear connect focus on it as well. There's some interesting other highlights, very small things that aren't very obvious. But if you look at the very top, you'll see there are multiple loops or just little hooks from the top there for cable management, probably designed for iCue Link cables by the looks of them, quite large. And yet this comes with Corsair's new fans, which aren't iCue Link. These are RS120 RGB fans, which, as you can see, have multiple cables coming out of them. This is a really interesting departure from their other iCue Link fans and from their older fans as well, which I'm going to do a separate video on. But I want to talk a little bit about here as well, because we're going to lead to some complexities in this build. The front looked pretty clean, the rear does not. And you'll see there's loads of cables sticking around out here, and it's quite a mess. Now, some of these are naturally going to be your front panel connectors, USB-C, USB-A, front panel, HD audio, and other things. But these fans have multiple cables coming out of them. That means they've got fan power and 5-volt RGB connections on each of the fans. There's also no controller, as you can see, included as standard, so you don't have a Commander Core or Commander Pro like you used to. And that's good because it wouldn't work with these fans anyway. These fans are not designed to work with those. Corsair is, for some reason, making those things obsolete now. So they're actually moving away from the Commander Core and the Commander Pro for their new line of fans, and you'll have to find your own controller. If you're interested, I'm going to do a separate wiring guide on these fans and show you how to best set those up. I'm also going to talk about it in the build guide and go into a bit of depth to make it interesting and hopefully useful to people. What you can see here, though, is that the cables have actually been looped together in a way, sort of. So each of these fans has two cables coming out of it, but they've then got these sort of extension cables running between them. So you can see they're actually connected together in this lineup of fan cables. But it looks a mess at the front. I mean, you can already see this mess here. And obviously the idea of this sort of setup with a rear connect motherboard is you want these cables to be nice and tidy. You don't want cables to be visible, we want them to hide them away. So you probably can push these to the back a bit, but initially it looks like chaos and more complexity for a lot of people because it's additional cables that you've got to work out where to plug in, and these are going to have to connect to the motherboard or to a fan controller, which you get separately. So at the back, you can see two different connectors, and then these extensions. So actually these three fans have ended up in two cables for those three fans because of the splitters. And then you've got cables here which suggest you could connect more to them. Then you're going to be daisy chaining in what? An additional rear fan or multiple other fans at the top. I don't know what Corsair expects there, but there's only so many fans that you'll be able to put into a chain and then connect to a single fan header, system fan header, or chassis fan header on your motherboard. So it's going to be a bit more complicated than usual. This is what the case looks like with an E80X motherboard. So this is a Meg Godlike motherboard, which is obviously a bigger one, quite old now. But you'll see at the top, there's multiple gaps for running your cables through. So for the EPS power cables, for example, they're very high up. They're very high up there. I think they might be hidden behind the radiator maybe once you've got that installed, but also quite a distance from the motherboard. So I think if you're using a standard motherboard setup here, that might be an issue. However, as you'll notice down at the bottom, you can see there's holes there which face downwards, so down towards the bottom of the case, right next to the motherboard, so you can run the front panel connector, the HD audio connector, USB cables and other things through there. Probably keep them quite nice and neat. But still, I think that gap at the top might make cables a bit messy. We'll see. But I wanted to show what it looks like with an E80X motherboard, which as you can see is hanging over the edge. So it's not supported at the very far edge of it. It's hanging over the edge near the fans, but I don't think that's massively a problem. It is secured with the multiple screws, so it has all its screws in place, but it's just not supported all the way across, or at least you don't have the case behind it all the way across. And this is a mini ITX motherboard. You can see even more how the gaps run around the outside. But you have plenty of places to run cables through to this motherboard. However, it looks probably really stupid with all the cutouts for the rear connect motherboard. So I wouldn't recommend using it, but I wanted to show what it looked like. I've put the 6500X and the 3500X next to each other because I want to demonstrate something that I've only just discovered or noticed. This is standard ATX motherboard. At the top, it obviously has the same holes, same sort of height as the ones on this. But what we'll notice is there's no rubber around the areas where the cables run through. So up here there is. So from this angle you can see them a bit more clearly, which means that you can hide those cables away a bit better. Whereas on the 3500X they just aren't there. So over there on the 3500X there are no rubber areas where those cables can be hidden away. So they're going to be a lot more exposed and a lot more obvious if you're running them through from the rear with a standard ATX motherboard. Interesting. The other thing I noticed is the 3500X is significantly narrower than the 6500X. So here you can see there's a lot less depth to the 3500X. It's nowhere near as deep at the back end, which is going to be interesting. So here are 3 RS120 fans. These are actually from a triple pack. And this is what you get. 3 fans and then the fan screws. And this is what's interesting about this, because just like in the case, these use the standard 5-volt connector and a fan power connector. And then they have daisy chain connections between them, so you can run one cable to another. This is a real interesting move from Corsair in my mind, because it's abandoning the Commander Pro and the Commander Core. These connections are not going to work with those controllers. So if you buy these fans and then that controller, just not going to work, which is weird and could cause problems, because if you've watched my video on how to wire Corsair fans, you would have seen me talk about those. You also notice it doesn't come with an RGB node or any sort of hub. So these fans aren't controllable by iCue. You cannot use these with iCue Link or iCue software because they just don't connect to an iCue controller. They connect directly to the motherboard. Now you can use another RGB controller with them, and I'm probably going to show the Thermalright controller, for example, or Razer's Chroma RGB controller, but you cannot use these in the traditional Corsair setup way. Now this is a really weird move, I think. It's interesting because it's like these are more affordable, accessible fans from Corsair. Maybe a bit less complicated, maybe. But obviously they want you to buy iCue Link fans to get the easier connectivity experience, because obviously these don't interlock. They have no sensors on them. They've got a lot more cables to deal with, so they're nowhere near as nice. They're still nice looking fans, and they look like the AF120 RGB Elite fans on the face of it at a glance, but they're not. They're very, very different. So it's quite interesting. This is the chaos of what I was talking about. So these are the fans. I've now put them in 2 groups. So technically they're daisy chained together because it goes one fan to the next fan to the next fan in terms of RGB and fan power, and then a single connector into the fan header and the RGB header. And I've done the same on both sides. So you've got 2 groups of fans, essentially only using 4 connectors on the motherboard. But obviously there's only 6 fans. You might well have 10 fans in your system, and then you end up with a problem in that you probably only got 2, maybe even 1 5-volt RGB header. This motherboard has 2 down the bottom here, and I don't think there's any more. There isn't any more. It's just those 2 down the bottom. Now, theoretically, it could probably daisy chain in some more fans because you do have another connector. So there's another connector up here for daisy chaining. So you could connect that up to a 4th fan and then to a 5th fan, whatever else. I don't know how many the header can take, technically, in terms of the daisy chaining connections. I'd imagine the more, if you had like 6, for example, we'd probably struggle. I haven't ever tried to add a whole load. But you can obviously see the cabling mess that we ended up here. Now, this is outside the case, in fairness. In the case, it wouldn't look too bad. You tie them down a bit and put them around towards the back. But the other thing is the daisy changing the power connectors. So you've got 3 fans connected up to 1 single fan header. I'd suggest don't do more than that. So 3 maximum, probably. I'd imagine the motherboard won't be able to cope with many more than that. You could probably get away with 4, but I would stick to 3, which means you then need, 1 fan header per group of 3. So if you had 6 fans, 9 fans, you then need 3. If you had 10 fans, because you've got 3 in the radiator, 3 at the bottom, 3 at the front, 1 at the back, then you're going to need, multiple fan headers. I've only got 3 fan headers down the bottom here. There's a couple more at the top, but some motherboards have less than that. So you end up with a cabling mess and a bit of a nightmare in terms of plugging them in. And then, as I said, doesn't work at the commander. Technically, you can plug the fan power cables into a commander core, but not the RGB connectors. So there's no point in using the commander core in this instance. It'd be a waste of money. But there are other options. The point, though, is that you have to use motherboard software for this. So you're using the motherboard BIOS or motherboard fan software for the fan speed and the motherboard RGB software, in this case Armory Crate, because this is a Zeus motherboard, for the RGB lighting. So no Corsair controls at all, which some people might love, because I know a lot of people hate iCue. So maybe that's a good move in that regard. But otherwise, this seems like a backwards step from Corsair, although a good one, because these cables aren't proprietary anymore, whereas previous RGB connectors were proprietary. So you needed a commander core and you needed the LED node or the LED core from Corsair, the RGB hub, in order to get their fans to work. And now you can basically connect them to any motherboard and potentially another controller. So that's something. This is my suggestion for perhaps uncomplicating things. Depends on your perspective, of course. But this is the Thermalright RGB and fan hub, which I'll link to in the description, which allows you to plug in 8 fans, RGB connections, and fan power connections into them. And then what happens is you run a single 5-volt RGB header and chassis fan connection from that control box to the motherboard. And then you plug in SATA power on the other end, so it needs power from the power supply unit. But that allows you to connect up 8 fans. So obviously I've got 6 here. Could add another 2 onto this controller potentially. Alternatively, with this logic of the daisy chaining, you could probably daisy chain one group and plug them into one of the connectors on there. So you could use the same logic as with the motherboard and thereby plug more fans in. But obviously it only powers 8 maximum. So that's just something to bear in mind. You don't want to put too many on a single connector because that probably wouldn't work. But this could then enable you to keep these cables at the rear of the case, hide them away a lot more, tidy them up, and also just to allow for the front of the case to be a lot neater as well, because you don't end up with all these cables sort of running through to the front. This is one potential option. There are others out there, but this is probably the easiest one that I've found. You can get RGB controllers separately instead if you prefer, so you could connect the fan power connections from the fans to the motherboard and then get an RGB controller. Thermalright does one. There's a Razer Chroma RGB controller. You could use those. Anything that will accept a 5-volt RGB header. That way you could have the RGB connections from that running to a controller, but the fan power is being controlled by the motherboard still. Now this obviously still allows your motherboard control. It doesn't have software because it's not using a USB connection. It just allows for easier cable management and powering of the fans, really. A bit more straightforward, I think, at least a lot less messy. There's a problem here that you need to watch out for with the rear connect motherboard on the back of this case. So if you have to plug in the 24 pin, which obviously you will, when you come to put it in here, what you might find is what I have, is that the clip on the outside edge of it, when it hooks over the motherboard, can't because of the outer edge of the gap here. So the metal running along the edge there is actually blocking this now. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do about this. I'm going to have to try and force it in, because obviously without this going all the way in, PC is just not going to power on, and that's going to be a problem. As you can see, push it, I can't get it past there. It's loose. You can pull it out. This thing isn't fully seated, and it needs to be. So that's obviously a big problem. Got to try and work out how to get that in. In order to solve this problem, what I had to do was loosen all the standoff screws, the motherboard screws, ever so slightly, so I could shift the motherboard just a little bit, hoping that you could push it back towards the IO shield a little bit more. Just push it that way, just a smidge. And then that was enough to be able to basically force this in. I wasn't very comfortable doing it, but now it is fully secured in there, so it's not going to come out anymore. It's a minor design flaw, and I don't know if everyone's going to have this problem, because I suppose it's going to depend very much on the motherboard, the distance that is. But you think it'd be pretty universal, so I'm surprised it's an issue. Very annoying, though, because obviously it's very important cable to have to plug in and to have to either potentially damage the power port when you're trying to push it in, or somehow just force your motherboard over. Not ideal. In case you're wondering, the same problem also occurs with the PCIe power connectors. So on this rear connect motherboard, you have power connectors down the back for the GPU. So you've got 3 8-pins and 1 of the 12-volt high power connectors. And the same issue occurs here because I can't fully plug this cable in for that edge of the case there. So along here where the edge is, just like this metal bit which rises up and blocks the clip from pushing all the way in. So I'm probably going to have to try and shift the motherboard over again, which is a pain. So there's another random problem here that it's worth looking at. What I'm trying to do right now is work out if I can run these PCIe power cables across to this side so that I can neaten them up. So if I cable tie these up, I can run them across here in theory, tie them to the 8-pin EPS power cables and run them down this so it can be sort of neat. But in order to do that, I need to put this hard drive cage back over the top of the motherboard so that it can run them behind it, I think. Or I wanted to see whether that was possible. So I go to install this and realise that it has these hooks at the top here. So you can see that it hooks on. Yeah. And they are now being blocked by the 8-pin EPS power connectors. Now, this isn't too much bother because you can just take them out and then do it. He says. It's a bit of a fiddle though. And then that's back in place. And then because the clips are on the other side, it's not actually a problem to put these cables back in place. So unlike the 6500X where those cables got damaged because of the hard drive cage, at least this goes back in. And it looks like I can do what I wanted to, so I can neaten this up. But the thing is, why do I have to remove power cables in order to install this first? Or do what I'm doing, pay attention to how the order I've done it in, do this hard disk drive cage first, or the SSD cage first, if you want to use it before you put your 8-pin power connectors in. It's these stupid little design things that you only really discover when you do things in an order that Corsair clearly wasn't expecting. Because now, if I want to take this off, for the opposite reason, which is to actually mount the SSDs on here, I've got to first take the power cables out, which again, is fairly easy to do in this case at least, but why have they designed it like this? Just a thumb screw at the top and bottom would have surely, if you had a thumb screw here and here, would surely have been better than this. Now, down the bottom of the case, there are 3 mounting points for fans. This side is interesting because I think it's probably, you could also do a cooling pump there from a custom loop system. But over here, we have the ability to mount a fan. Obviously, it's an intake fan. But as you can see, the power supply is basically right below this. There's a small gap, a very thin gap of, well, enough to run a cable through because there's one cable that's randomly stuck in there, which I think is the HD audio cable. It's just, I was tucking it away when I was at the back. So that's visible there. So that shows you how much gap there is. Basically enough depth for a cable. So whether there's any point in installing fan here or not, I'm not sure. My gut says there isn't because it would just be pulling against what is essentially nearly blocked. So you'd just be choking it. However, you could maybe get away with putting one here because that has more space down the bottom. Because I've cable tidied quite a bit at the back, there's barely anything below this, and that would obviously pull air from the rear there, potentially. How much it would actually do, I don't know. Whereas this fan down the bottom here makes some sense, but then it's just going to be blowing upwards. Now, you'd have intake fans across the front and intake down the bottom, so you'd have 4 intakes that way. But it's not blowing on the graphics card unless you've got a really long one. But maybe if I put 2 like that, you could do it. Now, I've only got 6 fans, so I haven't got enough that I could put these here and one as an exhaust fan as well. But you do have the option, so you could put 3 like this. I'm thinking maybe I'll just put 2 because of this cap, but that might look weird. But that's an interesting talking point, so maybe it will get people sort of, questioning why I've done that, and then I can explain the logic. For this 3500X build, I'm doing 2 different things and 2 different builds, which is something I've tried to do in a lot of case builds recently. Changing the fans or changing the position of the radiator or just changing the setup to make it completely different. 1, so that I can show people the different possibilities that it can do with the case, but 2, also so that I can test different performance metrics and have a more detailed review than other people. Now, this takes a lot of effort and a lot of extra time, and sometimes I wonder whether it's worth it, but I hope that it adds to the quality. Let me know in the comments if you think it does, because it'd be good to know. But one of the other things that I'm doing with this build is I'm using the new Titan Corsair iCue Link cooler. So this is a new cooler from Corsair in the iCue setup, so the iCue Link setup, so you can see all the iCue Link stuff up here, the wiring for that. And this is an upgraded pump and all sorts of other things that Corsair's developed in here to make it better than the previous ones. And one of them is the different pump caps. So as well as having the screen on there, you can also get these optional extras. So there's 3 different optional extras that you can purchase. A VRM fan, so a fan that sits on top of the pump. One that just allows for the RGB to shine through, this groove module, and then obviously the LCD screen as well as an alternative. So you've got 3 different things. But it's the small things that I like about the design here of what Corsair does and how much these have changed over the years. I thought it might be interesting to just briefly talk about this. So this is how this cooler's come out of the box. It's come with the radiator set up. The fans are already installed, which is joyful for setting up a radiator. In the old days, you have to get the radiator out of the box. You'd have to screw the fans in yourself. The screw holes weren't very good. It was hard to get the radiator screws in. There was a lot of hard screwing. If you look back at some of my really old H150i videos from like 4 years ago or something, maybe more than that, I had real difficulty installing the fans on there. That's no longer the case. They're already installed for you. Now, this is obviously set to exhaust. If I wanted an intake, I'd have to flip them over. But the fact that it's set up like that already is brilliant. Also up here, you'll see there are extra radiator screws included in standard. This is another nice touch. So a whole load of extra radiator screws included, which means that you can immediately set it up for push-pull. Now, obviously, there's not 6 fans included, but if you happen to have spare iCue Link fans or spare fans, you could put them on the other side really easily. The other thing that's interesting here, I wanted to note at this is this bracket. It's an Intel bracket. And on the packet for that, it says LGA 1700 and LGA 1851, which is the next socket of motherboard coming for Intel, which suggests that this cooler will work perfectly fine with the newer models of motherboard as well. So the Z890 versions of Intel's motherboard that will be coming soon, they'll support that. The other interesting design change there, which isn't immediately obvious, but is a very small one, but a subtle one that I thought was interesting. So historically, this backplate has had sticky tape around the middle and the edge here, which would stick to the back of the motherboard and hold it in place. Now, it's got 3M stickers instead on each of these corners. So the standoffs, as they sit on the motherboard behind it, the little rubber washers, have now got 3M stickers on them, which means this will then secure for the 4 corners instead of in the middle. So should have less wobble and less play in it. So there's some interesting design changes there. Now, otherwise, this is generally a iCue Link setup, so obviously it's going to have some interesting highlights to it. Another thing that I thought was interesting immediately is the design of the cooler. So here, obviously, pre-applied thermal paste, but the screws are already installed. So this is bracketed for Intel. These standoff screws are already installed in it. Very interesting design. So you're not even putting those in. You put the backplate in, you'll seat this on top of the motherboard, you just screw that in immediately. You don't have to worry about putting those in. No standoffs to go into the motherboard. Just screws into the backplate, which is quite a different change from your usual setup, basically with any other cooler that I've seen. Usually you'd have to screw in some standoffs into the motherboard. Now you're basically just screwing it into the backplate, which would be pretty interesting, I think. And then obviously with iCue Link cables, we'll be able to wire the cooler into other iCue Link fans. So I'm going to do a video showing the setup for that. with the standard iCue Link fans in the case. Also, obviously going to do a detailed guide on setting this up in a motherboard with Intel and AMD setups in the usual way that I would, as well as the upgrade options here for how to set that up. So hopefully multiple videos coming out of this. So subscribe to see those if you haven't already. So this is the wiring setup for the cooler, and I want to note something that's pretty interesting here. One of the things that I've noted, if you look at the pump head here, you'll see that there's a connector on here and a USB connection. Now, you don't need the USB connection unless you're using the display, so the display optional extra, you're putting that on instead. However, you do need this connection now, so you will have to run a cable from here through the top of the motherboard to the controller. And that is actually a change from the previous iCue Link coolers, because they actually abandoned that on other iCue Link coolers that I've seen and had the cable running through the tubes into the radiator. And then the radiator was connected to the fans, and then the other end of the fan, the cable would come out and connect to the controller, which meant you had a really clean pump set up because there was no cables coming out of it, because it was just the tubes and no other cables unless you put the display on there. And then all the cables ran from this radiator to the hub. But now they've actually changed that. So these fans are not connected to the radiator, and there's no connection on the radiator at all. So this is quite different from previous iCue Link coolers. So that's something interesting. But you do get 3 wires, so you should be able to wire them in with other iCue Link fans if you want to, and that's what I'm going to do. The other thing that's interesting is you can remove these. If you don't like them, you can just take those Corsair RGB sort of glow bracketing off the edge. So these are just optional. You can take them off, and obviously you could flip them round as well. So if you change the direction of the fans, which funnily enough I am going to, you can just get rid of them. Or change the direction of them. And one's now flown across the room and I can't find it. One thing that I have noted before in a previous video, but I want to mention it again in case you missed that, is this iCue Link controller is now able to control 12 devices per port. So you can have 12 things on either side for a total of 24. Historically, when iCue Link actually launched, this could only have 7 per side, but it's been upgraded now with firmware so the controller can manage more devices. If you notice that your fans are flashing red, that's because you haven't got the latest firmware, or you've got too many devices connected to one port. So if you put 13, for example, on this side, the fans will flash red because it's like, whoa, not enough power to control all of this. You shouldn't be using 13, so just watch out for that. It flashes red. That's the reason. If you're thinking about an iCue Link setup, I've done a video previously on the wiring guide and setup of the whole thing, but one of the most important things to know about iCue Link, if you don't know already, is that the controller requires PCIe power. And this is the connector, which is the same one as you'd use on your graphics card. So it's the PCIe power cable that's split into 8-pin or 6-pin and 2-pin that you usually push together to plug into your GPU. So this has to be plugged into here. And that is an essential part of the connection, because this needs the power, obviously, to power all the different things. The pump, the fans, the other fans in your system, the whole setup. Now, this is actually a problem, I think, for a lot of people, and I've had a lot of questions about it, and it makes sense. If you've got a pre-built system, or let's say you've got a power supply unit that's like 850 watts or less, you might find that you don't have enough power cables, especially if you've got a GPU that already uses 2 of these power cables or 3 of them. Then you might find that you don't have enough cables for this connection, which is a big problem because then you haven't got power for it. Now, Corsair specifically says on the frequently asked questions on the page for this cooler that you cannot use an adapter. Do not use a SATA to PCIe power adapter. So if you can find one that does SATA power to PCIe, don't use it because it won't give you sufficient power. This draws more power than a SATA connection, so the connector you'd use for the hard disk drives and SSDs in your system, and therefore there's an issue. Now, what is the solution to this? The solution to this might well be if you've already got a power supply unit, let's say a Corsair one, for example, that you can get a extra cable kit. So you might, if you've got the right kit, be able to buy one of these. So this is a Pro PSU cable kit, which has Type 5 cables in it. An important note, you have to have a Type 5 power supply for this, but you can get Type 4 cables as well. And essentially this is just a box of extra cables. They're premium sleeve cables, they're very nice cables, but if you haven't got enough cables for your power supply unit, you could use this instead. So you can see this one that I've just grabbed out of here is a PCIe power cable. So you could plug that into your power supply, assuming it's modular, and then you've got an extra cable. It's a bit of an expense to buy an extra cable kit just for that, but it is important. So it's important to know that you need that cable. So you have to find that as a solution. Don't try and mix and match power cables from a different power supply manufacturer, because the pinouts will be different. The connections on the power supply end will be different. It could cause big problems. Make sure you get a kit that's from your manufacturer, so from the brand that makes your power supply, whether that's Corsair, Seasonic, NZXT, whoever you use. Make sure you got the right cables, but you will need a 6-pin PCIe power connector for this setup. So with this cooler and with all the iCue Link coolers, you can get these additional attachments for the pump head. So this one's the fan one, and this one gives you RGB, and then there's display. What I have found, though, that I want you to know is if you're using these, it's really difficult to get them off. They're very stiff. They're held in place with clips at the bottom of the top and bottom here. They're really hard to pull off. I think if you try to do this when it's installed on the motherboard, you're going to have a real struggle. I have real trouble getting this off. And I don't want to damage the thermal paste, but I've installed each of these so I can get footage, but I'm having trouble just getting them off. It's very hard. Future Prawn here, and I'm happy to report that it's much easier to get these caps off when it's actually installed in the motherboard. I guess because it's secured with the standoff screws, it's much easier to pull those off. I was worried it wouldn't be, but it really is, so just ignore what I said previously. But here are the different caps in all their glory. I'm going to do some tests to show the difference to the VRM fan and the standard pump cap, because I think that'll be an interesting experiment. Or keep that for a separate video. So this is the optimal format according to Corsair. If you look at the manual for this cooler, it says that for optimal cooling, you have the tubes at the bottom running up to the pump, and obviously the fan set as intake, rather than having exhaust on the top, which is what most people would do. I personally don't like this view. I think it's horrible, and there's so much hang up about whether you can have it this way around instead, which is definitely better looking. People are so hung up on it being this way around, which I think looks better, because they worry about, oh, the tubes are at the top. No, that isn't the concern. The concern is getting bubbles in the pump here, which will happen if you did it this way, for example. You put the rad at the bottom, which obviously you can't in this case, but then you've got your block at the top. Any air that gets into the cooler over time will build up in here in the pump and then cause problems. There is potential for it to happen if you'd have it like this, but as a very low potential, because the air, first of all, has to get to enough that it basically fills the top of this area and then no liquid's getting through, which is why the optimal suggestion is this way around instead, because any air will end up trapped at the very top of the radiator here, won't get into the tubes, won't get into the pump, and therefore the longevity is better. But it doesn't look as nice, and often the tubes aren't quite long enough. And we'll probably find in this instance the tubes just about are long enough, but the GPU will then force them down like that, and you'll need to do this. And it might look okay. It's a personal preference. What matters more, the longevity of the pump to you? Do you see yourself using this for like 7 years, for example, where that would then be a problem? Because otherwise you're going to be under warranty anyway. Probably, I think this has got a 5-year warranty on it. A lot of them do. Or do you want to have a better aesthetic, better look in the case? Either way, whichever way around you do it, the optimal position is on the side here with intake fans, because this will cool the radiator down, which then cools the CPU down better, more effectively. So you have a cooler CPU. And then because you'll have bottom fans mounted here and here for the graphics card, they'll get cool. And then the exhaust goes out the top. So hot air's out the top. So it's optimum. People would say it isn't. People in the comments often say, oh no, it won't be optimum because you've got hot air potentially from the radiator coming through into the case. But then you've also got cold air coming from the bottom, blowing upwards. And all the hot air escapes at the top anyway. So in my testing, in several instances, in several cases, this is the best setup. Having your fans intake on your radiator on the side or in the front of the case and then exhausting out the top. Mission complete. I have now built it with iCue Link. So you've seen two different versions of the case, and obviously this is the iCue Link setup. I've actually used 3 fans at the bottom now instead of 2, although once again, probably pointless here because it's being blocked by the PSU. But what I wanted to highlight quickly is the wiring logic, because it could get pretty complicated and I had to give some thought to it. So what I've done here is you have the pump cable. So you've got the cable coming out of the pump going to the controller. So that goes to the iCue Link controller. And then you have a single rear fan, which then uses a short cable to connect to these 3 exhaust fans at the top, which then use a short cable, ideally, to connect to these 3 fans and a radiator, which then uses a short cable, in theory, to connect to this single fan, which then uses another cable to connect to this couple of fans, which then uses the longer cable that then runs to the back and goes to the controller. So all of these fans are in one connection and the pump's separate. And that seems like a lot, and you wouldn't have been able to do that historically with the original iCue setup because you could only have 7 devices. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That would be it. Then you'd be stuck. And if you tried to do these 3 as well, it just wouldn't work. Now, without this logic, the reason I did this was because otherwise you've got to have 2 controllers potentially. And that's why there's cables that are a bit messy in places. Because let's say if I wanted to connect these 3 and these 3, but then I want these separate because of the wiring, I wanted the wiring to be nicer, you'd need a second controller because obviously the pump needs a controller connection. Now you could, in theory, I think, connect the pump to the fan and then to the fans and then basically have it as part of the whole system. So the whole thing's all connected from here. So you have one cable runs from here. They say that you should run this to the pump, but I wonder whether it would work. You run this pump cable to the fan, then to that fan, 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 and then to the controller. And then you only have one cable. Or maybe pump to this fan, that fan, that fan, that fan. And then you have these separate. So this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one are on the other controller. I think that's interesting to discuss. It gives you some flexibility because you can have 12 devices per port on that controller. So it makes it a lot more flexible. I'm pretty happy with how this has come out as well. Although without the top mounted radiator, you can probably see there's a much larger gap up here. So the cables are visible. I've cable tied it as much as I can at the back. Quite well, I'd like to think. But you can still see the cable. You can obviously see the pump cable. And there are some other problems. Like this cable here, for example. It's a bit ugly. Not really sure what I can do about that. Unless you just didn't have this fan here. But then obviously you'd need to think about why that's wired in. But I'm pretty happy with it. I think it's come out pretty good. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And here's a look at my glorious cable management. I'm obviously being a little bit silly because it's not perfect. It is a little bit messy in places, but you can see I've tied a lot of things down. I think it's important to note that it's probably going to be pretty important to do this in the full wiring guide and setup guide. And I will show the process of how I did it and what you need to do. Because obviously this isn't as deep as the 6500X, which means there's not as much space back there for your cables. The channeling is also lacking. And so there's a few hooks that you can tie the cables to, but I ended up tying the cables to each other and tying them together so they were nice and neat. And obviously with the first time round when I built it with the standard fans, the cables were a lot messier. And then I ended up with the iCue Link setup and it's much neater, as you can see here. And I am happy to report that you can close the door on it, so it is possible to shut the door like this and close it away and hide your shame. But it is worth noting you do need to go to town on it, I think. If you have a really messy cabling back there, it's probably going to be a problem. I'll cover more of this in the review, but I wanted to quickly note that I found the iCue Link setup to be much quieter than the RS fans. So the new fans from Corsair, like wiring as standard, come with this case as standard, are much louder. With benchmarking and testing, I found it was a lot louder under load, under heavy load with Cinebench and 3D Mark, and just gaming was generally louder. iCue Link is much, much quieter. Plus, look, I just killed Tagilla, so winning. But stick around for the full review to find out more about what I think of the case in depth, and also obviously the wiring guide of the fans and the wiring guide and setup guide for the case. And hopefully, if you made it this far in the video, you found this useful. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.